Hello, we're raising more questions, and this time on a very hot subject. Not that the others haven't been hot too, but in the past few days, the president and then the leader of North Korea, Mr. Kim, have been very worrisome. A lot of people around the world are really upset at what's been going on. There have been a lot of hot rhetorical words going back and forth, and people are wondering, are we close to nuclear war? Are we close to literally blowing up the planet or ending civilization or something? A lot of people around the world, especially obviously in Japan, are very, very worried about that kind of thing. In Japan especially, because let's remember, exactly one country has started a nuclear war in order to finish a regular conventional war, and that country was the United States of America, and we did it to the Japanese in 2 cities in Japan in 1945. So the Japanese must be especially worried, and they're very close to North Korea, obviously. So the whole point is, today, we're going to take a look at 3 basic things. There's an old way to handle nuclear defense, nuclear weapons, and so forth, and there's a new way, and then what it all depends on. And we'll end up with that, what it all depends on, and see whether or not a big question can be answered. Most probably not. The central theme of all this is there is a big question facing mankind, and it still has to be answered. So we're talking about the news, Trump versus Kim, in this case, the United States, sort of, versus North Korea. Sort of. We're not at war. It's all rhetorical at the moment. Threats back and forth. Could this lead to something terrible? That's one of the central questions. All right, I said already that the first thing that we're going to talk about is the old way of doing what? The old way of making sure, or trying to make sure, that we don't get into a nuclear war. Well, the old way of preventing nuclear war, preventing war at all, really depended upon the USA and the USSR. That's Russia, the way it used to be known, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Well, in the old way of defense, President Eisenhower, Ike, as he was always known, said, here's what we're going to do. Here's Russia over here. There's Russia. And here's NATO in Europe, and they are divided. We have a Cold War, Russia and NATO. Germany especially, very, very important. That's where the hot spot was, so that's why I'm talking about the Soviet Union, Russia, and NATO. Once again, Russia, NATO, especially G for Germany. The old way of defending ourselves from what was regarded as the evil of communism was to have an overwhelming nuclear response ready to fight the Russians as soon as the Russians invaded, if they were going to, in Europe. And the Russians were fully capable of doing that with an awful lot of tanks, an awful lot of men and women in uniform, and they would have won. They would have won maybe in a matter of hours, certainly in a matter of days, if the United States hadn't stationed troops over here after World War II in what became known as the Cold War. So back to the point, the old way of making sure that the Russians thought twice before they invaded, or didn't invade at all, was to have nuclear weapons over here provided by the United States in West Europe, in NATO land, especially in Germany. And the idea was, under the old way of thinking, under the Eisenhower way of thinking, the Soviets will never do this if they know that we're going to rain upon them a gigantic thunderstorm of nuclear weapons and destroy Moscow and the rest of the Soviet Union, which we would perfectly well have been able to do. Well, that came under some questions later on, because a lot of people started to maybe realize, maybe it's really true, in other words, the Soviet Union, if it wanted to, could invade even under the threat of nuclear retaliation. The Soviet Union could drive its tanks into Germany and so forth, even under the threat of nuclear retaliation, because the people, the leaders in the Soviet Union, might have been thinking the United States is never going to start a nuclear war. because that could end life on the planet. So therefore, if we, the Soviet Union, drive our tanks into Germany, we can take Germany. The Americans are never going to retaliate with a nuclear war. That would be bad for the entire planet, and the United States is rational, and the United States isn't going to do that. So along came JFK in the later years of the Cold War. This would be in the 1960s, in other words. And he and his people invented something called flexible response, FR. Flexible response. In other words, they told the Soviet Union, fine, drive your tanks over here. We will not necessarily rain upon you with nuclear weapons. But we will have two things: really small nuclear weapons that won't be raining upon you all over the Soviet Union, and we'll also have a much better conventional force, tanks and so forth, tanks and people, a much better conventional force to meet your response, to meet your initial aggression. So then the Soviet Union, so went the theory under the new way of thinking, the Soviet Union would think under the new way of thinking, unlike in the old way of thinking, the Soviet Union would think in the new way of thinking, boy, maybe we better not drive our tanks from here into Germany because the Americans have threatened to meet us with their tanks, and they're perfectly good tanks. They could beat us maybe. And that was a more believable deterrent. That's the whole idea. The Soviets could believe that we would indeed counterattack with our tanks. They might not have been able to believe that we would counterattack with nuclear war. So this became the new way of thinking, and it kind of dampened the Cold War down a little bit. It got a little bit, it's hard to say whether the relations got warmer or not, but in the Cold War, things got better between the Soviet Union and the West after this new thinking evolved from JFK. Now, what did all of this depend on? And this is going to lead to the big question that we just can't even answer. What all of this depends on is a sort of an academic idea, but it's really big in diplomatic and military circles. All of this mess over here, this now represents the mess of war, all of that depends upon rationality. If the West says rationally, if NATO says rationally, the Soviets could invade, you know. Is that rational? Probably. Then the next question with regard to rationality is, are the Soviets rational enough to believe that we will counterattack with our tanks? And then the question evolved beyond that. What if the Soviets do something like put their rockets, their missiles, their nuclear weapons over here in Cuba or someplace like that? Is the Soviet Union rational enough to realize we would indeed crush not just Cuba, but the Soviet Union with every possible nuclear weapon? That's the question. Is the Soviet Union, are its leaders back then, are its leaders rational enough to understand that if they attack and put missiles in Cuba, if they attack with nuclear weapons, are they rational enough to understand that the Soviet Union will be disappearing from the planet because America will shoot back with nuclear weapons? Well, as everybody knows, in 1962, October 1962, the Soviet Union moved its missiles over to Cuba, installed missiles in Cuba that could very easily reach America, less than 100 miles away. And the question is, was that rational? That's a really important question, as we'll see in a second. Well, JFK, of course, John Kennedy, responded to that on national television, assuring the Soviet Union that if those missiles were used against America, America would retaliate not against Cuba alone, but against the Soviet Union with America's full nuclear capability. Pretty big threat. Now, was the Soviet Union and its leaders, were they rational enough to believe that threat? And was that threat from JFK rational? These are tough questions to ask and to answer. So let's go back to the news. We have Trump versus Kim, the US versus North Korea. Both sides have been attacking each other rhetorically with a war of words. And the president has come under a lot of criticism for the fiery brand of speaking that he's been using. But again, let's back up. Decades ago, JFK had no sense of humor in the Cuban Missile Crisis and did say, you get those missiles out of Cuba or you're in real trouble. And if you ever think of using them and do use them, the United States will react against the Soviet Union with a full retaliatory capability. Well, was that rational? Or was that something that a man on the moon or Mars, safely far away, would say, that's nuts? And were the people in the Soviet Union rational enough to understand that JFK would actually do that? Well, it turned out that rationality prevailed. So let's go back again to the news. Do we have rationality now? That's the really big question. Is our current president rational? He's come under a lot of criticism for being not rational. But I'm saying, again, go back here to what JFK was saying that night in October '62. He too used very fiery language, and apparently it worked. The Soviet Union did back down. So it's not necessarily true that fiery language is going to unleash nuclear war from the other side, but then again, that only holds true if the other side is rational. So you have to ask, is North Korea rational? And if you pull back and look at this situation from a psychological point of view, here comes the big question. This is part 3. We saw the old part, the old way of thinking about nuclear weapons. We saw a new way to think about nuclear weapons. They both depended upon rationality. The last question is, how rational is mankind and womankind? How rational are people? We seem to see a lot more violence now. One reason for that is we can see it. There are TV cameras everywhere. We can see everything globally, almost in the entire cosmos, as a matter of fact, when you think about the Hubble telescope. What we can see now, compared to decades ago under JFK and Eisenhower, what we can see now on the globe is a lot more violence, and we see it instantly. So if Mr. Trump says something, that's immediately broadcast to North Korea. It doesn't take 5 days to get there. It might not have taken 5 days back in the old days either, but let's hang with that point just for a second. It used to be, when nuclear capability was first starting out, when it started out, that it did indeed take days for something to be filmed for the news in Europe and for it to get back to America. It took days, or at least many hours, sometimes days. Nowadays, as it's happening, you watch it on your phone. You watch it happening. So we're under a new condition now, and that is we don't have to wait for the news. We don't have to wait 2 or 3 days to find out that Mr. Kim in Korea is mad and he's starting to make preparations maybe to attack Guam. We don't have to wait for that. There's no time to consider what our response should be. We have to have it, and we have to have it known right away. That's why it's maybe good that Mr. Trump indulged in that fiery rhetoric right away, because he knew that there was no time to sit around and think for 2 or 3 days, the way we could have under JFK. So the question is there enough rationality in the world or not? Sigmund Freud, who knew a lot about psychology, he's criticized a lot, but everybody still quotes him, had a theory. He took this Greek concept called thanatos, which is the urge that people seem to have for death. He took that and wrote books about it. Whether he wrote books, I don't know, but he certainly talked a lot about it. And others since him have also said, and before him, but he's the pinnacle, There is something called thanatos that might lurk in the human mind, and that is a desire, believe it or not, for destruction. And again, that's what makes everything so dangerous right now, in league with the fact that right away, not in 2 days, right away, leaders know that leaders are mad at each other. And does the urge for destruction weigh more than the urge for the opposite force, peace, love, etc.? That's the big question. Is there a desire in the human brain, the human mind, for thanatos, that's something that drives humanity, in other words, toward destruction of the enemy and even destruction of oneself? So the last question is, how strong is thanatos in the human mind? And before anybody dismisses that right away and says, that's impossible, it wasn't that long ago that Adolf Hitler ruled Germany. Here we are back to Germany. Adolf Hitler ruled Germany. And in the closing days of his big war, World War II, he decreed, we have to destroy Germany, the very country that he ruled. We have to destroy Germany. That became, in the last weeks, his only strategy. It wasn't about defeating Russia or defeating America anymore. He decreed it's time to destroy ourselves. And the Germans almost did it. A lot of his people cooperated. So it seems like there is indeed a driving force in the human mind toward destruction of others and destruction of oneself. And that's the question for this episode. How strong is the human desire for peace versus the human desire for destruction? Nobody quite yet has the answer. We'll work on it.